and other schools like UC. So let's try to get through this without the Twitter happenings of last night in our psyche. So you're in the right place if you're coming to the event titled No Rest Until We Divest, the Struggle for Human Rights at Home and Abroad. So welcome. I'm going to be introducing the speakers in order of appearance, and I'm also going to be giving you an intro of what the event is going to be about, just to tease your palate and make you stay. So thank you for coming out. You're coming to us at a very unique moment in time. Just like I mentioned last night, UC Riverside passed a resolution that called for divestment from companies that profit off of the illegal occupation of Palestine. I love that I just said that. And also UC Santa Barbara and San Diego State attempted the resolution. Passing unfortunately didn't pass, but they're going to come back stronger. So I'm going to say they will divest. It's not a question of if, but when. Not too long ago, our own campus, UCLA, successfully passed a bill authored by African Student Union to divest from the prison industrial complex. So I want to stand for that. So what we're seeing is that at home, activist struggles for social justice are making connections and are gaining momentum, meaning that a huge reason for this upsurge is that more and more activists are beginning to connect their struggles. Here tonight are several speakers who have done just that, and they'll be talking about making connections at home and abroad, and using divestment as a non-violent political tool to alter social change. And I'm really happy to introduce these speakers to you. So tonight we have Alia Prima, who's the editor and co-founder of Electronic Intifada and author of the book, The Battle for Justice in Palestine, who will be joined by two UCLA students who have also worked or are currently working on divestment campaigns, focusing on the prison industrial complex and Israel and Palestine. So our first speaker in order of appearance is Marissa Hall. Marissa is a fourth-year Afro-American Studies, and her diploma will say department now because we just got the Afro-American Studies department. A double major in political science, and she's a student council member and external vice president here at UCLA. And I'm just going to read a little bit of what her office does, what her job is, to give you a background. So the external vice president is the elected student body officer charged with representing undergraduate students to all off-campus entities that affect student life at UCLA, and in leading the student body on issues external to the campus community. These decision-making bodies include the UC Regents, the UC Office of the President, the California State Legislature, and the California Governor, as well as the U.S. Congress and the City of LA. Busy lady. So our next panelist is Donna Levan. Where's Donna? Donna is a fourth-year psychology major, and she is the president of Students for Justice in Palestine. And her work, she has been one of the main co-authors of the divestment resolution that we brought up as part of the divestment efforts from SJP. And she's a wonderful leader, and she's stepping down as president this year, so this will be her last event. So let's give her a warm applause once again. Finally, but certainly not least, Alia Prima, as I said, is also the co-founder of Electronic Intifada, the author of this new book titled The Battle for Justice in Palestine. He's also the author of One Country, a bold proposal to end the Israeli-Palestinian impasse, and is also a contributor to the Goldstone Report, the legacy of the landmark investigation of the Gaza conflict. He has contributed to several other books and written hundreds of articles on the question of Palestine in a wide array of publications, including the Jordan Times, the New York Times, the Guardian, the Los Angeles Times, and Al Jazeera. So join me in welcoming all these wonderful folks to the stage.
Hi, that was a really awesome introduction. You made me sound really cool. So I'm here to talk to you today about really a campaign that we've been working on for a while now. It's just this past year it's been picking up a lot of steam, particularly around prison industrial complex. It's something that during my time here at UCLA, I've grown to be really passionate about through my research as you mentioned, African American Studies and Political Science, relating how the political sphere connects to my identity as a mixed African American woman, Latina woman. So this campaign was really near and dear to my heart. And I would say it kind of began over the summer when students from across the UC came together at the UC Student Association Congress, where we chose a campaign that we were going to work on for the entire year. And this campaign was called Ignite: Invest in Graduations, Not Incarceration, Transform Education. And this is my pride and joy. I absolutely love this campaign. So anyway, you heard about Ignite, Ignite's where it's at. It's tackling the issues that we see in the state of California with this move towards continuously incarcerating the people of California rather than educating them. Moving towards having the creation of more and more prisons in the state of California, and really in the United States as a whole, rather than creating more opportunities to receive an education, particularly K-12 and higher education. So that's the campaign itself. One of the really key aspects we had this year was I partnered with the African Student Union. Some of the folks, not everybody's here. Janae was one of the people. Janae Williams, wave your hand. She was one of the people that helped author the resolution that we introduced to the Undergraduate Student Association Council, which is the student government here for undergraduate students at UCLA, to divest from private prisons. And it was an interesting experience for sure, because I'm sure, as you know, all of you are in this room, the topic of divestment is one that oftentimes is viewed as a bad word in a lot of the spaces on this campus. And so I knew going into this that we would have to make sure that we were framing the conversation and controlling the rhetoric that was around it. And oftentimes I feel like being on the table at council saying that yes, this is a divestment resolution, but divestment is not the entirely surrounded around one community's issue. Divestment is not something that you can solely hold on to as one individual. I mentioned divestment from the South African apartheid that we did back in the 70s. African Student Union, as well as the Undergraduate Student Association Council, pushed our UC region to divest from Coca-Cola. Now they're back. But for Coca-Cola, for the past around 30 years, we didn't have Coca-Cola on this campus because students stood up and said, we do not want to be complicit in what's happening in South Africa with the apartheid state. So I decided, well, let's go ahead and translate to this campus and say how we don't want to be complicit in these companies that are profiting off of private prisons that are building in the state of California. So just kind of breaking down like private prisons, what they are. Private prisons are, well, they're prisons that private corporations decide to manufacture and make. And they make contracts with prison unions as well as politicians to say that we will create these prisons if you give us enough inmates to fill the beds. So like, that's weird. Not saying that we have criminals, we have people who need to be incarcerated. We're building prisons and then saying, let's fill them up with people. So that's backwards. I don't know about y'all. We go to UCLA, that sounds backwards logic to me. And we said that we don't want to be complicit in this anymore. And we had solidarity from all sorts of communities. We had people from ASU, we had people from Metro. We had SGP rolled out deep. We had someone from Santa Barbara came and spoke in support of this resolution and said that divestment is something that can be applied to so many different communities and the struggles that they have, because really divestment is the best nonviolent tool we have. I mean, if we think about it, like, we're not going out there, we're not doing something where we're inflicting violence on someone else. It's us taking the resources we have and saying that we're not going to put those resources into something that is violating someone else's human rights, someone else's humanity, someone else's life. So that's why the private prison divestment resolution unanimously passed. It was really exciting. We ended up controlling the conversation in the way that the other council members that may not have been pro-divestment decided they were going to be pro-divestment anyway for that night. And then 2 weeks later we decided, or no, it was a week later actually, right? It was a week later. A week later we brought the divestment from companies that are currently profiting off of the illegal occupation of Palestinian lands in violation of human rights. So that was a completely different conversation. And it was something that, for those of you that were there, I'm sure you remember it. I was one of the unfortunate individuals that were up at the front of the room and having to hear 9.5 hours of people from both sides talking about why or why not they did not think that we should be passing or failing this resolution. And I can just say that was really definitely one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. And not at all to take away from the fact that there are people currently in Palestine who are directly being harmed by the fact that we are still complicit, but it was the fact that so many individuals seem to really miss the point of why we brought forward this resolution and what we were trying to do. There's all this argument around do nothing, we shouldn't do anything, we shouldn't pass a divestment resolution, we should never bring it back. This creates tension on campus, this is bad for campus climate. But for those of you that know, campus climate isn't all that great. So it's like, by saying that it's completely contradictory to say that this is going to make campus climate worse, when there are people on this campus who already feel as if the campus climate is not welcome to them and their communities. And by us saying that we weren't going to divest, because I'm sure you all know we did not pass the divestment resolution, and by us saying that, it was us saying that we still want to be complicit in these human rights violations. We still want to be complicit in these atrocities that are happening, not on this campus, but are affecting people on this campus and their families and their homes and their communities. So that was one of, I'd say definitely, probably the least proud moment I had on the Undergraduate Student Association Council here. But it was, in a lot of ways, the night itself was one of the most proud moments I had, because there were so many different communities that came out in support for that resolution. And I mean, to be frank, it was a damn shame that it didn't pass. There were dozens of people who came out for representing so many different communities saying that this is something that we're here for. And if people notice, like, the organizations, Students for Justice in Palestine, you notice how it's like Students for Justice in Palestine? It doesn't just say Palestinian Students United. It doesn't just say a particular community. It's anyone who is a student and who is a part of this movement who wants justice for Palestine. And I think that that's beautiful. That's something that anyone and everyone can get behind. And I hope that in the future, although I'm graduating, I hope that we can bring back divestment to this campus and that it can pass on this campus. And we will be on the right side of history, because right now UCLA is lacking and we're usually at the forefront. So hopefully we can get together, and I have faith that those of you that aren't graduating are going to be carrying on this movement and working towards more divestment. I mean, we divested from not only private prisons, we've divested from fossil fuels, we've divested from conflict minerals. We have used divestment as a tool for years. So why not use it as a tool for this particular issue in this particular community? But that's kind of what I have. Anyone have any questions or anything? Questions? No? Concerns? Issues? Yeah.
Why did you mention the prison industrial complex in the beginning, and how does that relate to divestment in Palestine?
Great question. So the prison industrial complex it's complex. It is essentially, all of us, I can start by saying, all of us currently are complicit in the prison industrial complex. All of us are contributing to it. Point blank, are in the, on the hill, the bedposts, the, what are they called? The beds that we have, the chairs in our classrooms, oftentimes those are made by people who are in prison and incarcerated right now. And if we're talking about incarceration, I feel like I'm not really expanding upon like what it is. There are currently more people incarcerated today than there were right at the end of slavery who were enslaved. So there are more people who are forced to do labor against their will. There are more people who are incarcerated more often than not for non-violent, low offense crimes and getting locked away instead of being sent into institutes of education. In the state of California, we have shifted from being one of the best public university systems in the entire state to being 49th. Yet our prison population continuously keeps rising and rising. And this isn't something that is just nobody's paying attention, no one's watching. Governor Brown has been told by the Supreme Court that we are over capacity. We are incarcerating too many people, yet what change has been done? Moving folks to jails instead of having them be inside of prisons? That's not at all a solution. We're not working on restorative justice techniques. We're not working on educating folks and having it be like, if someone makes a mistake in their life, how do we move forward from that and make sure that they come back to being a contributing citizen in the world? Instead, we're going in the direction like, you made a mistake, we're going to lock you away and throw away the key. And more often than not, the people that they're saying that to are from communities of color, black and brown men in particular. And now the largest growing prison population, like new attendees, are going to be black women. So when I said at the beginning how this hits home to my community, as a mixed African American and Latino woman, this definitely hits home. The fact that students who look like me are trapped from 2nd grade to go to prison rather than to go to higher education is a problem. And the fact that nobody's talking about it is an even bigger problem. So the prison industrial complex is something that we could have an entire night on, and I don't want to take away from the focus of this event. But the prison industrial complex is so complex. There are people like McDonald's is profiting off of private prisons in the prison industry. McDonald's, the uniforms, every time you go to McDonald's, you are helping ensure somebody remains in prison. Every time you go to Target, you're helping ensure that somebody remains in prison. Because these companies are investing their money into these private prisons and then getting built. What's your question?
I want to make a quick point. It seems like the prison industrial complex is related to Palestinian issue because the response to throwing people in jail and there's jail population on the planet is completely disproportionate to the amount of crime we have. And it seems like it's directly related to quarantining people in the slums and then bombing them with like white phosphorus. It's a completely disproportionate reaction to things that aren't really related to crime at all.
That's a great point. The fact that racial profiling is also an aspect of the prison industrial complex. The fact that there are checkpoints, not only in America, but there are checkpoints in Palestine, where there are individuals, mothers, who have to give birth to their children at checkpoints, versus being able to go to a hospital because simply by virtue of their identity, simply by virtue of who they are. And that's how really I feel like the struggle between our communities is us being marginalized, disenfranchised, and really just kept out of positions of power and positions of being empowered is, I think, the connection between what's happening in Palestine and what's happening here today, especially with our borders between the U.S. and America, or U.S. and Mexico border, and the fact that the same companies that are making the checkpoints in Palestine are the same companies that are being recruited to make the checkpoints in America. Yes.
And I guess if you don't want to talk about the prison industrial complex in one aspect, but my question is about that. Okay?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So I heard you mention that students or people of color are being,
Funnel, school to prison pipeline.
yeah. So can I introduce
You want me to explain the school to prison pipeline?
well, yeah, like the difference. Why is that so?
Why does that so? That's a very complicated question. I think there are a lot of reasons why that's so. I think that some of it has to do with the priorities that we have in this nation and really whose identity holds worth. Like whose identity is worthy of deserving and educating, who's worthy of deserving the attention and need that they need to be successful. And that translates into a lot of different ways. The fact that inner city schools have the majority people of color populations, black and brown youth in particular, and the fact that those are also the most under-resourced, underfunded, understaffed schools in the nation. The fact that you can go to Beverly Hills and it's only a few miles away from another school, and they have complete disparities where there's AP classes, IB classes, there's college counselors, there's SAT test prep, there's all of this, but then you go somewhere else and there are folks, I know even some people in the audience who grew up in Inglewood and have never even come to UCLA prior to getting into UCLA. Shout out Alex. And the fact of the matter is, like, him being a black man and not being outreached to being down the street basically is completely nonsensical. How does it make sense that we're not reaching out to the communities in which we live in? Because if we look back to like the mission of the University of California and really public education as a whole, it's to serve the state of California. And now it's more of like K through 12 is being utilized as a daycare service, where parents can drop off their children at the beginning of the day, and then at the end of the day, hope that they are still there and pick them up and take them home. The fact that when a student goes into, like, depending on where they go to school, they can have several checkpoints. They can have somebody pat them down before they walk in. They can have somebody have them go through a metal detector. They can have a wand going through. They can have random searches of their lockers. If you're in a classroom environment, if you're supposed to go to a place where you're going to get educated, how would it make you feel if you're being treated as a criminal as you're walking into that classroom? Which leads to the fact that people of color are, particularly, I know I keep like harping on this like, specifically because this is where my research lies, but particularly the fact that Black men are more likely to be suspended, which makes them 4 times more likely to not graduate from high school, means that we're creating a further and further education gap. And then if you have people who aren't getting the education they're not getting their education, then they go on and have children, and then their children aren't getting adequate education, and then their children aren't getting education. I'm the first in my family that's going to graduate from college. Like, that's something that, like, coming here, I had to figure out the FAFSA for myself, I had to figure out financial aid. I mean, all of these sorts of barriers that, not to talk about the fact of, like, where I come from and not even being in LA and having to make that tradition, but that sort of, like, these are barriers that are put in place that affect certain people where others are getting, like, an expressway.
Thank you.
Do you want to add to that?
Yeah, just that I mean, you got to have the barriers put in place, and just to remind people, the barriers are zero tolerance policies in the 1980s, no child left behind, the criminalization of the school system, the fact that the LA school police is the largest police force, they attach to any school district in the country, and it was established in 1949, the fact that they ticket children for being late to school. So in other words, there's a criminal justice system that was imposed that transferred the issue of discipline away from teachers and principals to an actual criminal justice system. And that has, this is exactly what you're saying, that there's an institutional framework for this. And that's why we've had racism for a long time, but the actual criminalization of children was ramped up since the 1980s. You know? So I think that's part of the issue.
And it really stems from, I believe, a geopolitical solution. The fact that people think that, especially because during the 1980s, a lot of factory jobs that used to be here priorly were being shipped overseas. So there was a lack of a lot of jobs in the state of California. So we're like, well, we don't have jobs, how do we create jobs? Maybe we can just lock people up instead. That'll be easier. So there's like you said, the war on poverty, the war on drugs, these sorts of things by criminalizing the fact that crack cocaine is more than powder cocaine, like the sentencing, despite the fact that they're both relatives of drugs, the fact that there are more likely for a certain community to use this sort of drug and another community to use their sort of drug, but there's a difference in sentencing, that shows that there's like a disproportionate, really systemic ideology. It's like racism isn't just like, I don't like you because you're white, I don't like you because you're black, I don't like you because of that. It's systemic today. It's not as blatant as how it used to be in like Jim Crow, where it was for colored and for white. It's now very under the radar by the fact that students who are students of color who don't have access to like college counselors or knowledge of these different universities. Before I came to UCLA, I'd only been to one university before to like look at and tour. And that's like someone not saying that they don't like believe in someone, not reaching out to them, not having like creating this access is also a really big factor.
Right, and then if people have more questions, we can take more at the end, but for the sake of time, thank you, Marissa.
So I'm Diana, president of SJP, and as you all know, a couple months ago we brought up a resolution to divest from companies that profit off of the violation of Palestinians' human rights. And we really started working on this campaign about a year ago, as several divestment campaigns were coming up across the country, like the private prison divestment campaigns. And especially after ASU brought up their resolution, we really needed to push to demand moral consistency of our university and of our student government. If we can vote one week to say that we don't want to invest in violence against one community, we need to be able to uphold that same standard across communities. So it's really imperative that every community on this campus, including the Palestinian community, are able to demand certain standards of our university and demand where our money should be going and that we should have ethical investments. So really, SJP 1 year ago started getting together, talking about what kind of things we could demand at UCLA of our student government and ultimately of the UC regions. And we came up with 5 companies, as many of you know, that are really involved in the occupation. So there's Hewlett-Packard, which is involved in the checkpoints, Setbacks and Cement Roadstone Holdings, which built the illegal apartheid wall in the West Bank and the settlements. There's Caterpillar, which bulldozes Palestinian homes illegally. And there is General Electric, which puts the engines in fighter jets that mass bomb Palestinian populations. And we really just came together in this year, because of the way the council was looking like, decided regardless of what a vote would be like, we needed to push for this. Because Palestinian students on this campus have been treated as second-class Bruins. We're the only community that has actively asked for our money to be removed from corporations that harm our families, and we're consistently silenced. And so throughout our campaign, we really try to make it as transparent as possible. We held weekly teach-ins, we held office hours several times a week. We met with council members for months and months on end. The ones in this room know how that went. And we even went and met with very openly anti-divestment organizations such as Bruins for Israel and Hillel, and actually showed them our resolution and tried to get their feedback so we could make it as least harmful as possible. And we really made the resolution written in a really strategic way to focus on Palestinian students who are on campus and the Palestinian community that are being affected by these companies. Because we didn't want a resolution that was just going to go target Israel and lay out everything that's happening by the occupation, but really tying it to where's our money going and how is this affecting Palestinians and Palestinian communities, and really putting Palestinians at the center of the discussion to educate about the occupation. But throughout the process, a lot of charges were thrown around. There's SJP members being called anti-Semitic, which I don't really need to get into that, because SJP openly is against anti-Semitism in all forms of discrimination. And we were also asked to co-author the resolution. So basically members of BFI and Hillel who opposed divestment demanded of us that we write the resolution with them and that we seek their approval if we want to bring up a resolution about Palestinian rights, which is absurd and no community has to go through that. But Palestinians, again, were put at a double standard. And even up to the night of the divestment resolution, council members were saying, oh, only if you sat and met with Hillel and BFI and actually wrote a resolution together, though they had openly told us they would never accept a divestment resolution of any kind, and didn't actually have any problems with the actual text of a resolution. We're consistently put at this standard where we need to get approval from our opponents. For example, if Bruin Republicans wanted to put up a resolution, they wouldn't ever have to seek approval from Bruin Democrats to do so. And so we were really put at a double standard in that regard. Another big argument that came up was that our resolution was part of the wider boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, and that we wanted to wipe Israel off the map and really target Jewish students on our campus. Though SJP endorses the BDS movement, we made it very clear from the beginning that we're not asking anyone else to. So that whole argument was really out of the air. Though we didn't focus a lot of the time on explaining what BDS actually was and what it calls for, which is an end to the occupation, equal rights for Palestinians living within Israel, and the rights of refugees to return as guaranteed to them by international law, that was still consistently brought up as something that was this evil thing, though as Marissa brought up, BDS is something that was used in South Africa and has continued to be used in many campaigns today. There are just 3 separate tactics: boycotts, divestments, and sanctions. And we were just wanting to utilize one tactic to remove our investments, because the status quo is that we are invested in companies that violate Palestinian human rights, and the only way to change that is to withdraw our investments, which is divestment. So we really didn't have any alternatives. And unfortunately also, throughout the whole campaign, there was a lot of talk about how this was very divisive, and how if council members were to vote for divestment, they would be painted as anti-Semitic. There were threats to people losing their jobs once they graduate, saying basically members would go and talk to these council members and say, if you vote for divestment, we'll make sure you don't get a job, we'll make sure that your social life is completely torn apart, and other types of fear tactics and intimidation tactics. And that's aside from receiving hate mail throughout the few months, and especially after divestment, even though it didn't pass. Many members, such as myself and council members, other SJP members, received consistent hate mail for supporting divestment, for supporting the same tactic that was used just 2 weeks before our campaign, for supporting the same tactic that's been used with fossil fuels, and many other campaigns. So really there is this really double standard set on our organization and our members. And when it came down to it, what was really at the core of the anti-BDS, anti-divestment really, movement on campus was the fact that students felt that we needed to perpetuate the occupation. The conversation never came down to whether or not Israel was committing human rights violations. The conversation was always about justifying those human rights violations, be it for security, quote-unquote security, saying that we need to cage in the whole Palestinian population because they're dangerous, and if they're not caged, they'll come and kill us all, which is just inherently racist and Islamophobic. So whether it was that or many other ridiculous arguments that were said, all of it really came down to the need to protect Israel's occupation, Israel's illegal occupation of Palestine. And we really saw this perpetuated through who the key leaders in the anti-divestment campaign really were. They were members of the Israel lobby, and this is really significant. I think Ali will probably get into this in his talk a bit, but really seeing the presence of the Israel lobby on our own campus and taking over our student government. 3 of the council members received paid trips to Israel through organizations that are openly anti-divestment. They run anti-divestment campaigns, organizations that are Islamophobic, and these are the people who are sitting on our council. Receiving paid trips even though they have absolutely no affiliation with Israel, really just taking over council and going into it with a closed mind, being like, their campaigns will be funded by these organizations and they'll support will come from these organizations so long as they don't let something like divestment pass at our campus. Along with several other non-council members who are involved in the anti-divestment campaign, who are paid by the Israeli government, who are Hezbollah fellows paid by the Israeli government, or liaisons to AIPAC, which is the national lobby for Israel. Seeing really that the whole Israel lobby is taking place on our campus and really taking over and trying to suppress student voices. So whereas there were external organizations really running the anti-divestment campaign here, we pulled together a really amazing grassroots campaign with over 20 communities represented. I won't try to name them all, but because there's too many, but ASU, MECHA, MSA, every really big organization, hundreds of people coming out speaking for 9.5 hours that are personal to them or just in solidarity with the Palestinian people and Palestinian students on our campus was a really remarkable thing. So although divestment didn't pass, I think it's really important that we reflect and look at the significance of actually bringing it up and seeing what happened on our campus here. Regardless of any of the lobbying that happened, we were able to gather hundreds and hundreds of students in a campaign that probably cost less than $500, a couple hundred for flyers or whatever, but able to bring up together hundreds of students to really push back and demand what is right and demand equal treatment on our campus. We were able to fight back against the suppression of Palestinian speech and free speech that is anti-Israel or that's criticizing the Israeli government. We were able to push back against that. The rhetoric on campus really changed. The Daily Bruin covering divestment for weeks on end, with countless op-eds and pieces written, with other organizations writing pieces about Palestine and Palestinian human rights in each of their own respective community papers. And really even walking around campus hearing random people I've never seen before talk about Palestine and divestment, things that they've heard other people talking about, things they've heard in their classes, and really shifting that rhetoric and really giving Palestine a presence on our campus, which is remarkable because we're not going away, right? We're going to keep coming back because we're not going to accept the status quo ever. The status quo is that we're invested in companies that are funding the oppression of Palestinian students' families, like my own, and that's not going to go away until we're not going to go away until we change that. And so, although there may be lobbying and intimidation tactics going on our campus, I'm just looking at who's in this room right now. I think it's really important to see how far we've come over the past year, over the past few years, and really understanding that we need to capitalize on this moment, regardless of what council looks like next year or the year after, that divestment will continue to be brought up until we have victories like the ones that happened at UCR last night. And it's really important that we continue to look at the significance because this isn't just our campus, this is something that's happening across the state, across the nation, which Ali is really gonna talk about. But it's something that is really significant, and a lot of people are really talking about this moment in history as the tipping point for Palestinian human rights, where the average student can walk on campus now and actually acknowledge that Palestine is a place, that it's something that exists, that there's something going on there, even if they don't know what it is, but they're seeking to know more, and just having those discussions in spaces where students of all backgrounds can come and really support Palestinian human rights. One of the biggest achievements after divestment was the formation of Jewish Voice for Peace on our campus. So definitely, if you want to get involved with that, talk to Gabriel and Jacob afterwards because they're doing really great work. But now there's a space on campus where Jewish students can actually go and feel safe talking about what they're going through as a Jewish individual who doesn't believe in the politics of Hillel and burns for Israel, and really having that space to do work and work really closely with SJP, which is really remarkable. So as you can see, we're really at this tipping point, not just at UCLA, but across the nation. And I talked too much, so I'll hand it over to Adi to really go into what this is looking like at a national and global scale.
Really wonderful to be at UCLA. My first time here, and this comes at the end of a long week traveling around California. It feels like a month. But I've saved whatever energy I have left, I've saved it for you. And I managed to walk past In-N-Out Burger today without stopping. Because I always gain weight when I'm in California. I'm really thrilled to be here and to have listened to the discussion that we just had, the comments of Marissa and Dina. And really, there couldn't be a more perfect start to the discussion that I hope we can have tonight. I'm really excited to share the battle for justice in Palestine. This book is something that I put a lot of work into, but those who have already read it know that it reflects, and I hope honors the work of many, many more people, including all the students involved in Students for Justice in Palestine and other groups, students at UCLA and students at UC Riverside. Congratulations. I was at San Diego State 2 days before they had their divestment debate last night, and the energy there was incredible as well. Last night I was with Max Blumenthal in San Francisco, and more than 200 people came out to hear a discussion about BDS. It was really amazing. Everywhere I've gone, the kind of energy that you are bringing to this work on campus is evident. A few weeks ago I was at the University of Michigan when they were having their divestment debate, and I know that many of you were following this. And even though the vote didn't pass, just as the vote didn't pass here at UCLA, that didn't matter. Because it's not just winning the votes that counts. I was amazed by what I saw. Hundreds of students, unprecedented numbers. Everyone who was there said, we've never seen, members of the student government said, nobody comes to student government meetings. Well, they had to move it to the largest ballroom in the Michigan Union. And even then, hundreds of people were turned away or had to go to overflow rooms. 2,000 people were watching on the live stream. Now, they can't all have been members of SJP. I wish they were. So something is happening. And it also struck me that, I've been working on this issue for now, it's kind of hard for me to think about it. 20 years. 20 years goes by in a flash. And when I was in college, we didn't have what you have created. What you have created now is something really special. We would have events on campus, we would organize vigils, we would bring speakers, but we didn't know what was happening on any other campus. We didn't talk to students on other campuses. You've created a national movement. And it's a movement that is growing and that is so powerful and significant that the Israeli Prime Minister has to stand up at the AIPAC conference and spend a third of his speech denouncing it. And it's a movement that is so significant that I'll say more about this, and Dina already said something about it, that Israel lobby groups are investing immense resources in trying to stop you. We're used to, unfortunately, our senators and members of Congress being taken on all expenses paid propaganda trips to Israel. We're used to national groups, national anti-Palestinian groups like the ADL or AIPAC lobbying senators and members of Congress. But when did they start lobbying members of student government? It means they know something's happening. And I'll say more about that. This book was very much a learning experience for me. And an important part of it came out of the fact that I live here in the United States. This is where I am. And the work that we're doing for justice in Palestine, we're doing here in the United States. And as the more and more people realize that the so-called two-state solution is actually a disguise for apartheid, a disguise for institutionalized racism, and as more people understand that it's not going to come about, so they are getting excited about the idea of democracy in historic Palestine, decolonization in historic Palestine, a future where everybody, even if they're not Jewish, can have full rights in their homeland. People are getting excited about that. And sometimes we say, you know, the United States is a country that has come through so much. The land we're on was the land of indigenous people, and then conquerors came. And this land was also part of Mexico. And then the United States took it. And then the people who were there, people whose descendants call themselves Chicano, were discriminated against, were denationalized, were made strangers in their own land. And there was slavery in this country, and there was Jim Crow. And we often congratulate ourselves and we say, look what the United States has put in its past. But there's something very troubling too, and this discussion that began here tonight already pointed to that. It's what Michelle Alexander has called the new Jim Crow. And so I started my book not by talking about Palestine, but by talking about the new Jim Crow here in the United States. And somebody asked the question earlier, what does the prison industrial complex have to do with divestment related to Palestine? The answer, as I hope you will see, is everything. It has everything to do with it. Michelle Alexander's book was really profoundly affecting. The work she did is so important, and she follows a long line of others, including Angela Davis, who have been working on these issues for many years. And what she points out is that, yes, it's true that Jim Crow was defeated in the United States, that legally everyone was equal. And we have now a officially colorblind society. Now, who followed the news about that? I'd never heard of this guy, this rancher. I'd never heard of him, but he's in all the news because he made some pretty disgusting comments. I won't repeat them, but the gist of them was that black people, African Americans, he didn't use those terms, by the way, might have been better off under slavery. What Michelle Alexander teaches, and this has created, as it should, outrage. And even the right-wing closet white supremacists are coming out and denouncing it. But what Michelle Alexander teaches us is that such episodes generate outrage precisely because they are so rare. There is a lot of spoken racism in this country, but it's generally not by people in official positions. If a major media figure says something of this kind, they tend to lose their job. And so that gives the impression that racism is a thing of the past. But while these kinds of statements can generate outrage, what passes without notice is the systematic and institutionalized racism that is actually far more devastating to people's lives than the comments of some crazy rancher out in who knows where. This is what Michelle Alexander labeled the new Jim Crow. And she says, what has changed since the collapse of Jim Crow has less to do with the basic structure of our society than the language we use to justify it. In the era of colorblindness, it is no longer socially permissible to use race explicitly as a justification for discrimination, exclusion, and social contempt. So we don't. Rather, we rely on race. Rather than rely on race, we use our criminal justice system to label people of color criminals, and then engage in all the practices we supposedly left behind. Today, it is perfectly legal to discriminate against criminals in nearly all the ways in which it was once legal to discriminate against African Americans. Once you are labeled a felon, the old forms of discrimination, employment discrimination, housing discrimination, denial of the right to vote, denial of educational opportunity, denial of food stamps and other public benefits, and exclusion from jury service are suddenly legal. As a criminal, you scarcely have more rights and arguably less respect than a black man living in Alabama at the height of Jim Crow. We have not ended racial caste in America, we have merely redesigned it. And the truth of this is apparent in the shocking numbers. Behind each number, the story of an individual and a family. This is the country that imprisons, incarcerates more of its citizens than any country in history. Any country in the world now and any country in history. Just the other day there was a news story that the Netherlands now has more people who work in prisons than it has prisoners. They have a total of 9,000 prisoners and just over 9,000 prison staff. And they just ordered the closing of another 8 prisons. In the United States, we have 2 million people in prison, and the numbers have gone up and up and up. From the late 1970s, there were 300,000. There are states in the south of this country that have populations of 7 or 8 million that have more prisoners than the United Kingdom, which has a population of 60 million people. And the fact is that the vast majority of the people in prisons are African American and Latino. No other country in the world imprisons so many of its racial or ethnic minorities. More African American adults are in prison or under correctional supervision, probation, or control than were enslaved in 1850 in the United States. In 2004, more African American men were denied the right to vote due to felon disenfranchisement laws than in 1870 due to formal racial discrimination. In jurisdictions across the United States, black men are admitted to prison on drug charges at a rate ranging from 20 to 57 times greater than white men. In 2006, 1 in every 14 black men was in prison, compared with 1 in every 106 white men. The systematic removal of black men from their communities has produced such a significant gender gap that the difficulty many black women face in finding life partners is a widely discussed phenomenon. What Alexander points out, based on her very meticulous research, is that no crime statistics can explain either these disparities or the rapid and dramatic rise in incarceration. I'm not going to go through all the research, but you should read Michelle Alexander's book, and I summarize it in The Battle for Justice in Palestine. The point that is critical and where we begin to move down the road where we get to the connection in Palestine, is that the racialization of crime was not an accident. This was a policy. It was a consequence. It was really something that followed the civil rights movement and desegregation. It began with Nixon's Southern strategy. And this was basically, it's hard to believe now, but the Democratic Party used to control the South. They were the party in power when civil rights legislation was passed. And this produced a lot of resentment against them. And Nixon, who was president in the late 60s and early 70s, wanted to capitalize on it. And the idea was to talk about crime and to blame African Americans in particular for crime, but never saying so explicitly. But it was really in the 1980s with the so-called war on drugs that the government and the media really pushed this idea that crime and drugs are a black thing. It was very deliberate, it was systematic. The 1980s was the time when mythical and fictional figures which still haunt America, like the young black male super predator or the black woman welfare queen, were invented by the media and still used today to demonize and marginalize people. Along with this, we've seen the ratcheting up of sentencing, as Marissa mentioned, the militarization of policing, the stripping away of Fourth Amendment rights with the blessing of the Supreme Court. So now today we have, when I was driving to the airport in Chicago, I live in a neighborhood called Hyde Park, and you drive down 55th Street for about 9 miles to get to Midway Airport. And I saw along that stretch of 9 miles, 3 police cars with their lights flashing. Each one of them had black men up against it being frisked. And that's common in Chicago. It's every day. Chicago is about the same size as Toronto in Canada. The same population, same size. I go to Toronto all the time. I've never even seen a police car in Toronto. I'm not kidding. Now, it doesn't mean that police there don't target minorities. They do. But the scale is something that just can't be compared. In fact, when you ask people in Canada, where are all the police? They are in the neighborhoods where people of color live. In Chicago, they're everywhere, but it's on, I think in our city we have tens of thousands of police. We have, I don't know what the numbers, it's over 26,000. This has grown up a massive industry of prisons, private prisons. They make billions, tens of billions of dollars a year. And they have lobbies. They have people who lobby for these businesses to keep the prison doors swinging open and shut, bringing in new people, because they get paid by the prisoner. The more prisoners they have, the more they get paid. And where this converges with what's happening in Palestine is that this hyper incarceration, this mass incarceration, has been really seen by Israel as a business opportunity in a number of ways. And as the war on drugs has escalated over the past decade, as America's foreign wars have intensified in Iraq and time, Israel's occupation of Palestine has emerged as a direct inspiration for many American officials, police forces, federal, state, and other officials. And as Naomi Klein has pointed out, in the past decade, Israel has become the world's shopping mall for homeland security technologies, reaping billions of dollars. In 2012, Israel's security and defense industries saw record exports worth $7.5 billion, which means that they've almost doubled over the past 10 years. And they're selling a whole range of technologies from drones. It was mentioned that the Obama administration just a few weeks ago gave a contract to a company called Elbit Systems. This is an Israeli arms company with the blood of thousands of people on its hands. And this is to build a security system along the US-Mexico border. And this system was developed where? It was developed along the illegal wall that Israel has built, separating Palestinians from their land. So, Palestinians are the guinea pigs, the laboratory rats for Israel, which then sells these technologies to the United States. Since 9/11, pro-Israel lobby groups have created a real industry of shuttling police chiefs from major US cities to Israel to learn from those who are supposedly the best. These missions function as important marketing opportunities for Israel's security industry, as well as to shore up ideological support for and identification with Israel among US elites. In the book, I provide a number of examples of these delegations, but I'll only mention one or two. An October 2012 delegation to Israel, the 10th of its kind, organized by the American Jewish Committee's Project Interchange, included officers from New York, Los Angeles, Oakland, Maryland, Austin, and Houston, Texas. On their itinerary was Megiddo Prison, near Haifa, notoriously one of the sites where Israel holds hundreds of Palestinian political prisoners, including children. These also included so-called administrative detainees who are held without charge or trial, a practice Amnesty International has frequently demanded Israel end. Some of you may know the name of Khadr Adnan. He is a Palestinian who was held for a prolonged period in Megiddo prison without charge or trial. He'd never been charged with a crime. And he went on hunger strike for 66 days in early 2012, and he forced Israel to agree to release him. Another case, another person held in Megiddo prison is Mahmoud Sarsak, a 22-year-old, at the time, Palestinian star footballer who was a member of the Palestinian national team. He was picked up on his way to a football match, kept in prison for almost 3 years, never charged with a crime. He went on hunger strike for almost 3 months, and nearly died. He said famously, in an appeal from the prison, he and another prisoner, when they were on the edge of death, he said, "It is better that we return to you living and victorious than in body bags." And they returned living and victorious. They were free. But many hundreds, thousands of prisoners remain in prison. One who did not get out is Arafat Jaradat, a 30-year-old father of 2 young children, who was tortured to death in Megiddo prison in February 2013. one of the participants in one of these junkets, which went through Megiddo prison to showcase how wonderful Israel is, was LAPD Commander Richard Webb, who praised the Israeli officials he had met as, quote, world leaders and innovators in counterterrorism and security, who, quote, do their duties while vigilantly protecting human rights. Webb vowed, quote, to take many lessons I learned back to Los Angeles. I don't want you to think that I'm saying that without Israel's influence or inspiration, that the LAPD would be a great example of modern community policing, serving the citizenry without regard, or the NYPD or the Chicago Police Department. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that there is a parallel in the ideology and the outlook. The reason the LAPD commanders, by the way, that was in 2012, but if you follow the LAPD Twitter accounts, you'd know, and they put out press releases, that they were there again just a few weeks ago, tweeting about how they were meeting with Israeli military and security officials and how wonderful it was. I didn't know the LAPD had a foreign policy, or I don't know, why are they there? What are they doing there? So, I lost my train of thought. You can see the effect of a week of traveling. Yeah. It also goes the other way. This is where the other shoe drops. The Israeli government is heavily promoting its so-called homeland security industry. For example, in 2012, the Israeli consulate in Chicago brought top Israeli police officials to Chicago, and there they met with they addressed hundreds of US law enforcement officials in St. Louis, Chicago, Detroit, Minneapolis, many more cities. And they encouraged these US police officials to attend the HLS 2012 conference, Israel's premier Homeland Security Seminar and Exhibition. In other words, what I was saying, where they would sign contracts and buy technology, and remember, hundreds of billions of dollars over the past 10 years have been coming from the Department of Homeland Security being pumped into local police forces, which are looking more and more and more like military units. You know, right. So what I'm saying is that it's not that, the police would be just wonderful without the Israeli influence. It's that the opportunity Israel provides is for good old-fashioned American apple pie racism to be repackaged as foreign expertise. And a really good example of that, there are a number of these in the book, but a really good example is a pilot program at Boston Logan Airport, where the TSA had hired the former head of security at Israel's Ben Gurion Airport to design the security system at Boston Logan. This was supposed to be a pilot for the whole country. And they called it behavior pattern recognition. And this man went to the media, and there were glowing reviews about how, wow, this is a really clever Israeli technology where they can look at the ticks in your faces, or they can, smell what pheromones you're giving off, or something that tells them that you're up to no good. That they figured it out. This is how it was solved. It wasn't racial profiling. But then the TSA officers themselves blew the whistle, and they went to the New York Times. And they said, what we're doing isn't behavior pattern recognition. It's not some clever technology. It's racial profiling. And what we're being told to do is pull over black men who look like their clothes are a bit too fancy, Latinos, people we suspect of immigration violations. What does a TSA checkpoint have to do with immigration? And they blew the whistle. That's just one example. The NYPD, which has been spying on Muslims and other communities of color, they had a list of 28 ethnicities they were spying on. This program, which they claim to have cancelled recently, but I think they're just renaming it, was designed by a CIA agent seconded to the NYPD called Larry Sanchez, who told his colleagues that he had borrowed the idea from Israeli methods of controlling the occupied West Bank. In other words, again, the Israeli methods are being brought here to the United States. The companies that profit from this are the same companies. I mentioned the Megiddo prison. I could mention Al Jalami detention center, where Palestinian children are routinely taken, beaten, tortured, threatened with rape. This is according to reports from the Israeli human rights group B'Tselem, from Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International. They've all collected dozens of accounts from children who've been through these detention centers. And who's the company that provides them with their technologies? It's a British-Danish company called G4S. G4S has been the target, a major target of Palestine solidarity campaigners around the world. It's a global company. And they've been successful in getting a number of institutions, universities, and others around the world to cancel contracts with security contracts with G4S because of their role in profiting from Israel's torture of Palestinians. But G4S is also one of the biggest prison contractors in this country. They run detention facilities all over the country, federal, state, and county. They run juvenile detention centers. They are major profiteers from mass incarceration and the new Jim Crow. So the question that was asked earlier is, if G4S is the same company that is profiting from the abuse of Palestinians and profiting from the incarceration of people of color in this country, then how come we don't have one campaign united around all these issues targeting G4S and other profiteers? G4S is just one example, but there are many others. There's a company called Veolia, another European multinational that's coming over to the US big time. They're in California, they're in Chicago, they're in Boston, and what they're doing is, as cities privatize public services, Veolia takes over those public services. So they run buses, they run garbage pickup, they run water systems, privatized water systems, and they also profit from the Israeli occupation. They're involved in a number of projects. There were some significant victories in this country against Veolia recently. There have been huge victories in Europe, where Veolia has lost billions of euros worth of contracts because city councils, responding to public pressure, refused to let them bid or turned their bids down. But in the US, where it's even a harder road to win these victories, there were victories. Veolia tried to come into St. Louis, Missouri and take over the water system. And they were given a preliminary contract with the city. They were forced out. They said, we're leaving because the opposition we're facing is so strong that it's not worth it to our reputation. Here's the key. Palestine solidarity campaigners were in the forefront of that campaign. But they couldn't have won it. They couldn't have turned it into a citywide mayoral election issue unless they were working with environmental and labor groups who were also threatened by Veolia. And that's how they won it, by working together. The same in Boston, where Veolia has come in and fired union bus drivers. And for the first time, or I think it's the first time, unions in Boston are sitting down with Palestine solidarity activists. And that's a really powerful combination. So, I want to make the case, and I hope the book makes the case, that, and I will say more about the role of campuses, but I do believe they're in the forefront of social change. It's not just what happens on campus that matters, and it does matter, but it's that you and your peers will go out and you will keep with you. Now I sound like a commencement speaker. It's true. You will keep with you the experiences that you had and the ideas you picked up. And so the opportunity here to change the course of this country from an oligarchy run by the few for the few to a place that actually responds to people's rights and demands. One of the few places left where that battle can be fought and won is on campus. And nobody knows this better than the pro-Israel groups. And in the book I talk about, why is it, I mentioned, why is it that they're sending student council members on all expenses paid trips to Israel? It doesn't make sense if you think about it, right? I mean, these divestment resolutions, they're not even binding. You can't force the university to divest from anything. And several university presidents have said, we don't care what they vote for. We ignore it. It doesn't bind us. So why don't they just ignore you? Well, in the book I write about an organization called the David Project. This is a major pro-Israel organization. It's one of a number. Again, Dina had mentioned the Hasbara fellowships. Do I have your, I'm sorry.
Dan.
Dan. All right. I met a lot of people. I only got one vowel wrong. It's an important vowel. Dana mentioned the Hasbara fellowships. There is the Israel Project. There's a whole huge number of these organizations. They're getting huge amounts of funding from right-wing organizations. It's in the tens or the hundreds of millions of dollars. It's coming not just from right-wing, but right-wing and virulently Islamophobic foundations. And the David Project points out in a 2012 white paper, a policy paper, that the American public support for Israel remains strong overall, and that's true. Opinion polls show that, and pro-Israel people often like to boast about that. But the growing cracks in that support are most evident on campus, according to the David Project. And universities across America form, quote, the leading venue for anti-Israel activity and the spread of anti-Israelism. That's their terminology. The case for working to stop this dangerous trend is clear. And I'm quoting, universities are not only where the thinking of America's future political leadership is molded, but also where the worldview of a large swath of influential people outside of the political class, as well as in the population at large, is formed. In the rest of the world, the David Project says, Israel is already very unpopular. And that's putting it mildly. It comes consistently at the bottom of, the BBC does an annual poll around the world of 24,000 people, getting their opinions on various countries, and Israel consistently ranks at the bottom. So, in the rest of the world, outside the US, pro-Israel advocates are fighting to halt efforts to turn Israel into an international pariah akin to apartheid South Africa. But in the United States, where support for Israel is much broader, the David Project says that the battle is to maintain long-term two-party support. It's not good enough that we stop the US from becoming anti-Israel. We have to make sure the US remains pro-Israel. Yet they predict long-term bipartisan support for a strong relationship between Israel and the United States cannot be assured if the environments of key universities and colleges are largely negative toward Israel. Simply put, allowing higher education to continue, quote, in a milieu of pervasive negativity toward Israel by further generations of students may significantly weaken long-term American government support for the Jewish state. In other words, they say what it boils down to is the future of the US-Israel relationship will be decided on campus. And it's when you understand that it all of a sudden makes sense what has been going on. California has been in the front line. Students in California have been in the front line, and teachers too. The repression on campus has reached really unprecedented levels. Just recently, you may have heard Students for Justice in Palestine and Northeastern University in Boston was banned outright, the first suspension of its kind, and it was reversed because of the organizing. It was supposed to last till 2015. They didn't make it more than a few weeks because of the national response, including from SJPs around the country. By the way, I don't think it was a coincidence that I think what happened at Northeastern was part of a strategy, because that SJP was suspended on the pretext of mock eviction notices. For those who don't know what they are, this is a tactic that many campuses have used to draw attention to Israel's systematic destruction of the homes of Palestinians. So it's a flyer that contains facts about what Israel does. It's like it says, you know, it's a mock eviction notice, but they always say this is not real, and this is just to give you an idea of what Palestinians go through. They put them under the door of dormitories. This has been used all over the country. And in every case so far where it's been done, the pro-Israel organizations have come up with the same accusation, claiming, and in every case falsely, that Jewish students were targeted. And this is about, again, trying to single out Jewish students and claim that all Jewish students are offended by facts about Israel, what Israel is doing to Palestinians, and to use Jewish students as fodder in the campaign to suppress criticism of Israel. But when this happened at Rutgers University last October, the Hillel organization, the pro-Israel organization on campus, specifically demanded that the SJP at Rutgers be suspended, in fact disbanded completely, to set an example. And that didn't happen. Not only did that happen, but Rutgers officials said, well, we investigated. There's absolutely no truth to the claim that Jewish students were targeted. These flyers were distributed randomly in several dormitories. They just went to all the students there. It was a few months months later that SJP in Northeastern was in fact suspended after eviction notices. And I think it was supposed to be a test case, so that when these things happened on other campuses, the pro-Israel organizations could point to Northeastern and they could say to UCLA or to Berkeley or to wherever, why are you doing less than Northeastern did? That's the way you deal with it. You ban them, you suspend them. So the victory against the suspension of Northeastern SJP is much more significant than just what happened at Northeastern. It's about protecting the right to free speech on campuses all over the country. So, but in California, California has always been your hours behind everyone else, which every morning I wake up and I can't believe how everything has already happened. I wake up at 6 and I'm already way behind on my work. I'd like to have a voter initiative to move California to a different time zone. But it's been years ahead in terms of campus repression. And right now there are bills going through state legislatures in Florida, in Illinois, in Maryland, in the US Congress that either condemn or try to punish universities or academic associations for supporting the Palestinian call for academic boycott of Israel. But California started it with HR 35. That wasn't a binding bill, but it sent the message that the government, that the legislature of California, is calling on universities to repress students. And you know what? Universities have been doing it. The UC Irvine case, the prosecution of 11 students for protesting the Israeli ambassador. I tell that story in the book. And what is astonishing about it, the fact that, I learned when I was doing the research, yes, it was Orange County prosecutors, and we're told that Orange County is very conservative, very right-wing. They prosecuted the students. And they put the top homicide prosecutor on the case of these students who talk about racial profiling. Talk about racial profiling because it was a group of students who had been identified in the media as Muslim. They put the top homicide prosecutor, who could have been doing something better with his time, on prosecuting these students. But it was the university that arrested them and forwarded the charges to Orange County and colluded with Orange County prosecutors to take these students to court. So a university administration that was supposed to protect its students tried to have them criminalized, tried to get their records, which, as we know, in this system of mass incarceration, can stay with you and affect your career for your whole life. The whole notion of campus climate, you know about this in California, the claim that apparently it's not apartheid that upsets people. It's people who speak out against it who are disturbing the peace. It's the claim that has been made with all of these cases of the mock flies is it makes students feel unsafe to be on campus. This is really when I was in university, people had struggled to put in place policies that would protect students and give them a place to go if they had been harassed racially or if they had been assaulted, to provide resources to prevent and hold people accountable for sexual assault, to make the campus a safe place. Because many of these campuses, remember, had been all-male and all-white institutions for so many years. They were not safe places. But now we have supporters of apartheid and bigotry usurping this language to say that if you talk about apartheid, if you talk about accountability, if you talk about the university taking an ethical role and divesting from companies that profit from blood, that you're making people unsafe. So, I want to close by saying, on a somewhat more upbeat note, it's really to say that the battle that is being fought on campuses is tremendously important, but it's part of something much bigger. The opening sentence of my book is the Palestinians are winning. And people might think that that is a strange thing to say, given the fact that on the ground in Palestine, for so many millions of people, things have never looked worse. But the case I make in the book is that we are winning the argument. Palestinians and students for justice in Palestine, as someone said, it's not, as Marissa said, it's not Palestinian students, it's students of every background for justice in Palestine are winning the argument on campus. That's why they're trying to shut you down. I had an experience today, a rather positive experience with the New York Times, which is really unusual. And especially because the past couple of weeks we've been hammering them literally over their censorship of news coming out of Palestine. We managed to get them to reveal the publication I co-edited, The Electronic Intifada. We managed to get the New York Times to admit that it is abiding by Israeli government censorship, something that it had never told its readers. We got them to admit it publicly, and we were hammering away at them. What the New York Times had been hiding from its readers is that Israel's secret police had arrested a Palestinian journalist, a citizen of Israel, held him incommunicado for interrogation for 5 days without access to a lawyer because he'd gone on a journalistic trip to Lebanon. This is something that no Israeli Jewish reporter ever faces for going to an Arab country. That's what the New York Times was helping Israel to hide. And their chief correspondent said that, oh, well, it's just like obeying traffic laws. That's what she said. She said if you go to a country and the government issues a gag order, you obey it like you obey the local traffic laws. So this is the free press. But, so they asked me to write a 400-word article last night. I said, sure, I would do that. For the website as part of the debate feature. Now, I'd written a couple of articles for them in the past, and believe me, you think that the negotiations over the debt ceiling or the negotiations, the Palestinian-Israeli, you have to fight for every single word. They come back to you on everything. You know, whether you can use the word occupied, whether you can, you know. And I wrote the thing, I sent it to them, and they published it as it was. And it was an article calling for a democratic state, calling for decolonization. They'd said, answer the question, will, you know, reconciliation between Hamas and Fatah help peace, or help the peace talks? I said, well, you know, a representative Palestinian leadership would, of course, strengthen Palestinians, representative and united. But the US should not be interfering in that. They should be pushing Israel to abandon ethnic segregation as a principle. That's where they can use their influence. So, that was a good experience to say that the space is opening up, that we can now say things that we couldn't say before. We can make arguments that would not be heard before. And that's largely because of the battles that students are fighting and winning on campus. Thank you. We have some time for some
Yeah, we have some time. Questions?
Okay. So just raise your hands. I'll see. Hopefully, I'm going to make sure to try and get to all sides of the room. Why don't we start here, the person in the green cardigan? Yes, you.
Awesome, thank you. That was very informative, and I love hearing all of it.
Thank you.
Particularly the last part where you mentioned about how college institutions were originally spaces for white men, and when that started to change, there was a lot of obviously like, campus climate was not prepared to deal with things that deal in particular on sexual assault. And so when talking to people about divestment and the power dynamics that go into that, I often bring up the parallel, because I do rape advocacy work on campus, I bring up the parallel that rape victims, when they go to UCLA and report, they're asked to negotiate with their rapist and to sit in a room and basically go through a dialogue and go over both sides of the story. And it's mediated by a person who really has no interest in the conflict, but has to come out with a solution that benefits both parties. And this is why in the almost 100 years that UCLA has existed as an institution, there's not been a single expulsion because of sexual assault. And I kind of, in using this parallel, I've asked myself a lot of ethical questions of whether or not I can use that parallel, and if it's an ethical parallel to use. And hearing what you said at the end kind of made me think about it, so I wanted to know your thoughts on that.
Well, it is a parallel it's what you say is very thought-provoking, and I think one should have some discussion. You know, that I'm glad you're really thinking about the ethics of making that parallel. But one of the things that comes out of it is that where there are instances where, you know, we live in a country and a culture where the word dialogue has very positive connotations, and the word confrontation is very negative. So dialogue, talking to each other, that's very positive. But I think there are many instances where dialogue or using this cover of dialogue can be a form of violence, because what it's doing is creating a false parity between someone who's a victim and someone who has harmed that person. And that's been the case with the whole peace process, so-called peace process, where, you know, the Israelis and the Palestinians are placed as if they're equals, and they're having a dialogue. They're not equals. You know, nobody, people, Palestinians understand that, but they're often told, well, you need to be in dialogue. No, it's very hard to think of examples where victims are told you must be in dialogue with the person who's attacked you. But this may be another example that you've identified, and that raises some really tough questions. And confrontation, on the other hand, which is viewed very negatively. But we should confront injustice. We shouldn't be afraid of, disturbing the peace when silence means allowing injustice to go unchallenged. And what is really appalling, and I tell this story in the book, in 2009, Ehud Olmert, the Israeli Prime Minister, came to the University of Chicago. I'm an alum of the University of Chicago. And actually, this was done by students from all over Chicago. We decided to prevent Olmert from speaking. I'll tell you, that was our goal. And it was a big auditorium, bigger than this. And when he stood up to speak. I was the first person to stand up, and I shouted as loud as I could, "War crimes are not free expression." And then I was taken out by police, and then the next person. It was all on video. It's on the Electronic Intifada. It actually inspired the Irvine 11 protest, and that came out in the trial. They had modeled their protest on us, and the prosecutors argued that this showed that they had the intent to prevent the meeting from taking place. Now, we were challenged. Like, the university said, "Oh, you know, we're defending free speech, and you are disrupting free speech." And so the university placed itself on the side of the moral high ground of free speech. The point that we were trying to make is we were not objecting to what Allman said or thought. We weren't objecting to him being able to come to the university and give his opinion. We're objecting to his acts. This is a man who murdered 3,000 Palestinian and Lebanese civilians, who had injured tens of thousands, who had caused destruction, who 3 weeks before had been the subject of the Goldstone report, which laid out all these war crimes. And they didn't bring him to the university to be held accountable for that. They brought him to give a lecture on leadership. And they paid him tens of thousands of dollars. And they couldn't care less when the students had gone to them beforehand and said, "Wait a minute, some of us have family in Gaza who were killed or displaced by this man." And they didn't care. So we concluded that confrontation was the ethical thing to do. Disruption was ethical. We weren't disrupting free speech. We were calling attention to war crimes that nobody would, the university officials who stood up and told us of this man's glowing record, they weren't going to mention them. So, confrontation sometimes is necessary, and dialogue is harmful. Sometimes. Dialogue can only be between equals. It can only be in the framework of justice, and absent that, it can be a continuation of the violence. Yes, that's my eyesight, but it's you, right?
Yeah.
That's, okay, good.
Well, I'm interested in the way people have responded to the book and how they responded to Max Blumenthal's book, Goliath. When Max's book came out shortly before yours, people came out and attacked him viciously. On Amazon, there were something like 50 or 60 consecutive negative reviews, one of which came out before the book was published, and none of them were even verified purchases on Amazon. So it seemed like there was an attack on him without even reading the book or even engaging in it at all. But with your book, that has been largely absent, and there's been different complaints about your book. You mentioned on Twitter that a lot of the paid propagandists are trying to ignore you completely instead of engaging in it. Why do you think there's a difference between the way people attack him and the way people attack you?
Well, I mean, to be fair, I do get my fair share of attacks. I think that, you know, the response I really care about is that people who care about the issue of Palestine read the book and hopefully find something in it that's useful. It's based very much on work that people are doing around the country. That's who the book is written for. It's not written for the critics. Sometimes it can be beneficial when, you know, someone attacks you and it brings attention to the book and more people know about it. But that's not the goal. I think partly the reaction is that Max Blumenthal, because he's Jewish, is seen by some people who think in this very sectarian way as a traitor, that he should have a loyalty to Israel because of an accident of birth. And I think, again, it's a deterrent strategy. We saw it with Judge Goldstone, Richard Goldstone, the respected South African judge who led the UN investigation into the attack on Gaza. They went after his family. They went after him in such a personal way until he finally relented and backed down and not officially, but personally kind of repudiated his report. Perhaps they thought they could do that with Max, that the pressure would be great enough. If so, they don't know Max. But they know that that wouldn't work with me, right? They think my natural state is to be hostile to Israel, whereas they think it's an unnatural condition for someone like Max or other people identified as Jewish that can be fixed with enough bullying. That might be part of it. And maybe they learned their lesson, that, you know, in the end, no publicity is bad publicity. Let's go over here. I'll come back over there. Yes.
Can you just talk a little bit about your path to becoming a journalist and starting the Electronic Intifada? And the reason I ask is because one thing that I've noticed a lot in campus coverage of divestment is that there are very few people of color in journalism, in our campus paper, who get the space to write. And so maybe kind of discussing that would show alternative models.
Mm.
Thank you. I still don't, I never intended to be doing this. It was never something I planned. It just kind of happened. I mean that. It's like I never, it was, I've gone in other, I thought I was going to go in other directions, but I just found myself being more and more pulled to doing this kind of work, precisely because of what you said, that I felt like the issues that I thought needed to be discussed or written about, the things that I thought needed to be said there was no space for them. And so when we started the Electronic Intifada, and that was in 2001, it was not with the intention of being journalists. It was actually a reaction to the mainstream media. Most of what we did was media criticism. But the internet opened up a space in that, you know, it began to break down the model that to reach people you needed to have huge amounts of capital. You know, you had to own printing plant or, you know, TV transmitters or whatever. That with a website you could actually reach people directly. And so then we started to say, well, we don't just have to react to what's out there. We can actually start doing the reporting ourselves. And so it was never an intentional thing, but it became something where I think we felt we could have an incredible impact often. I mean, it's very satisfying when you can, you know, make the New York Times admit something shameful that it doesn't want people to know, or that you can bring, I mean, one of the things I'm proudest of is the reporting that we've done. Many people, that my colleague Nora Barros-Friedman, who many of you have met, who has focused on reporting on what's going on on campuses, about AMCHA, the spying on students that's been going on. All of this is not in the New York Times, it's not in the Chronicle of Higher Education, and we just think it needs to be done. I mean, it's very hard these days to think about, you know, a media career because there aren't many jobs. There aren't institutional paths to do this. And if you do get a job in journalism in any kind of, you know, well-funded institution, the first thing you have to do is censor yourself. And so to remain doing this work without censorship, to be able to report the things and say the things about Palestine that we think need to be said, you're always going to be somewhat, you know, living on edge. You're never quite secure, you know. So it's not an easy path. But I think that the thing that I hope that students today can do is find a model to remain engaged after they leave university. I think that's so important because often, people's passion, they put so much into this on campus, and then, you go on and you have a career, and it's very hard to maintain it. But I think because this has to be a sustained campaign, there needs to be continuity. And so I hope there's a model where, even when people are going on to their careers, they can remain involved. And one of those things, for many years, I had a full-time job unrelated to this work. And then I did all of this work as well, because that was the only way I could do it. So it's not easy, but I just encourage people to do it and to think about how to remain involved. And the thing that makes the electronic intifada what it is the fact that anyone can contribute. We will work with you, we will make you check the facts, because we've got, the whole of this apparatus, Zionist apparatus, looking at us and trying to so we will test the facts, we'll make sure that everything is up to scratch, but we're open, and in this room I can see a number of people who've written for us. And so if you have ideas, if you have stories that you want to explore, come to us, the door is open, and we'll work with you. I'm happy to do a couple. You had your hand up. Go ahead. Yeah, in the red shirt.
So, it was very interesting hearing discussion of Divest, because as a Jewish student on this campus, I felt very isolated during the weeks leading up to that debate and on the night of that debate itself. And looking at the Jewish community as someone who was raised in the Jewish community, it's very interesting for me to see the ways in which devotion to Israel, more than of God, more than following the laws of kashrut, more than following the traditional religious observances, is the key marker of Jewishness for most official American Jewish institutions. And so my question is, how are we able to achieve a just solution in Israel-Palestine, and the just solution, get divestment passed on American campuses, when we have so much of the Jewish community, including members of the Jewish community who are quite liberal overall, buy into this equation of Israel and Jewish identity?
That's a great question, and I think that's something that's changing. That there is a sort of a sociological aspect to this, where the generation who were in university during the 1967 war, that was the time when the American Jewish community became much more pro-Israel, bought into the idea of Jewish nationalism, of Jews with guns that Israel represented. And that cemented the support for Israel, even among many people who are otherwise, as you said, liberal, and that's where the idea of progressive except Palestine comes from. I think that, many of their children don't have the same experience or the same identifications. And, the success story of Jews in America is that they are fully integrated, and young American Jews think of themselves first as American. And I've heard this experience many times from people who've gone on the birthright trips, who are then confronted with this really crude propagandistic message that they're given, that you should feel that you're Jewish first, that Jews are under threat, that the state of Israel is here to protect Jews, and they don't connect with it because they come from a generation that is really sincere about being a society in the United States that's open, that's accepting, that's multicultural, that's been pushing to tear down walls for women, for LGBTQ people, for people of color, and it's just, as Peter Beinart, the author of The Crisis of Zionism, astutely said, is that young American Jews, when it comes to Israel, they're asked to check their values at the door, and many of them don't want to do it, and they're standing up to this. So there are groups like Jewish Voice for Peace, which I think has really helped to change the conversation in recent years and to provide a space for people who want to be who want to make the point that or want to detach Israel or support for Israel's injustices from Jewish identity, which I think is very important. And recently there's been something called the Open Hillel movement. Hillel is a national organization, campus Jewish life organization. They have centers all over the country. And they have a rule, a policy that says Hillel houses, they have speakers and events that come through Hillel houses, that they are not allowed to have speakers who dissent on Israel or who support BDS or are too critical of Israel. So in effect, Hillel is the only organization that has an explicit policy boycotting Jews. And the Open Hillel movement is, it's happening at Swarthmore, Vassar, and other places where local Hillels are saying, we refuse to abide by this policy. That we refuse to be marginalized, to be silenced, to be told that we're less Jewish or we're less authentic because we don't toe this extreme hawkish political line on Israel. So I think that's really a great development, and the students who are fighting that battle to essentially for free speech and to express themselves have all my support. But it's tough, and it's tough personally when you feel that you are isolated in a community or even within your family. The number of people I know who are active in the BDS movement, who are Jewish, who say, I can't talk to anyone in my family about this. And I know how much having the support of my family has enabled me to do my work. So I can't imagine how difficult it is to be engaged in something like this and not to feel that support or to feel that, your family are against you or your friends or community. So it's really tough, but again, those spaces I hope are opening up. Thank you very much. Shall we take, I don't know if that was like my signal, your signal to me. All right, let's take the last two who had their hands up, which is the person in green and the person in the white shirt. And why don't you each give your question and then I'll wrap up. Is there anyone else who had their hand up who I didn't? Okay, going once, going twice. All right, you'll be the last two. I can just speak up.
Concerned about something you said, how you're anti In-N-Out.
I'm not against it. I'm absolutely, I'm one of its biggest fans, that's my problem. All right, thank you.
So, I have a question that I don't like asking, but I frequently ask it because it's something that I spend a lot of time thinking about. It's obvious that the state of Israel, in the long term, is going to lose the public conversation. They already are losing the conversation, and it's obvious where the tide of public opinion is going. And I think that BDS is definitely an effective tactic to constrain the actions of the state, certainly on the international stage. What I spend a lot of time wondering about is what's going to happen, or how is it going to play out with the folks I'd like to term the dead-enders. Baruch Marzel is not going to give up his guns and go away. Moish Fegelein is not going to fade away into the night. The terrorists in Yitzhar and Inamah, they're still going to be there. There's a ton of people in the West Bank who are there, they are armed, and they're willing to kill. And I guess the question that I keep pondering is, how do we come to an endgame solution, given that we have this, I don't know, ideal, I don't want to be insulting, but, you know, ideological body politic that's fundamentally committed to this concept of racism, and they're armed and they're willing to use violence to enforce it. And there's no political capacity in Israel. I mean, if the IDF were ordered to remove them, the ideology has infected the IDF and infected the Israeli state to the point that even they can't affect a solution. So what do we do with these folks who are armed and willing to use violence? How do we come to it?
Well, I don't want to minimize how violent they are or minimize the potential for violence, because I think you're right. These are people who do violence and could do more. However, one of the parallels I make in the book is, how do these transformations happen? How do settler colonial societies get down from the tree, let's say? The parallels I make with South Africa and Northern Ireland, I think, offer some hope that this can happen. I remember in the last years of apartheid in South Africa, yeah, I'm that old, I can remember these things. The same arguments were made. It was said that, you know, the white society is so mobilized, it's so scared, it's so ideological, that they would rather die than give up power, and that they would circle the wagons, you know, because they were, you know, settlers and pioneers who trekked in wagons. And so, you know, the idea of the lago was the Afrikaans word that was used. They would circle the wagons and form a garrison. And in the 80s, there was this phenomenon called the Afrikaner resistance movement that was gaining tens of thousands of members. It was effectively a neo-Nazi militia led by someone called Eugène Terre Blanche, and they were known for their uniform, which featured an actual three-armed swastika. They had it was exactly like a Nazi swastika, and except it had 3 instead of 4 legs to it. And the conventional wisdom was, you know, even if the white moderates are ready to give up power, these people will fight to the death. And of course, in the end, they didn't. They did quietly melt away. And for the most part, they certainly didn't succeed in changing the course, because they, like the Israeli settlers you talk about in Hebrew and other places, are only there because of state support. I mean, the settlers in Hebron would not be there without the Israeli government and the Israeli body politic behind them. So without that, if that starts to change, and in the book I talk about that how settler colonial societies, you know, how the grip of the racism and the fear breaks, and they can then begin to think about something transformative, those settlers lose immediately the base of support that allows them to seem like such a threat today. It's just like in this country. I mean, the KKK has never disappeared. And in some places it's even coming back. But the KKK was once the largest organization in the world. It had 6 million members. And you know, in towns across America, it was the main civic organization, the mayor and the police chief and the fire chief, etc., etc. It held a grip on this country that nobody thought could just, you know, disappear that quickly. So I would say it's a parallel. There are still whites in South Africa who believe that there should be a whites-only state. But they don't determine the course of events anymore. So yes, those people can cause trouble, they're dangerous, but they're not significant enough to have a veto in the future. Well, thank you very much.